Okay, so my name's Haines, and I'm going to be talking about zero price cost effectiveness today, the principle of are some patients too expensive to keep alive? So just a little background about me. I've been working at THETA now for around about 4 months. Prior to that, I was working at the National Institute for Care and Health Excellence back in the UK, more commonly known as NICE. I was working on their guidelines program as a health economist for around about 4 years. So a lot of my background is very UK specific. I did my master's in health economics at the University of York in England. So some of these issues I tackle with a kind of a UK-centric mind, but I've tried to keep this presentation as sort of internationally relevant as possible. Okay, so the content of this presentation is going to be one of 4 things. The first thing I'll be talking about is defining cost effectiveness. So what constitutes a cost-effective intervention is very important when considering the problem of zero price cost effectiveness. How health economists decide what constitutes value for money is of course going to decide whether some patients are too expensive to keep alive. The second part of this presentation, I'll be exploring the issue of zero price cost effectiveness, how it comes about and what the implications of it are. The third part of this presentation, I'll be outlining the costs that can be included in economic analysis and how health technology assessment bodies are moving forward. So when we do our analysis, we don't include all the costs that are available to us. We are exclusive about which costs we include and exclude. And of course, which costs we choose to include is going to have a big impact on zero price cost effectiveness. The final part of this presentation, I'm going to be looking at potential solutions to zero price cost effectiveness, or rather how we can move forward in the light of zero price cost effectiveness. So the first part of this presentation is all going to be about defining cost effectiveness. So how do we define what a cost effective intervention is? Well, of course, we use the term cost effective in all walks of life, and we consider it as basically meaning good value for money. However, of course, that's subjective. What is good value for money? How did health economists try and objectify this idea of what interventions constitute good value of money for the health service? Well, one common thing they do is we have predefined thresholds. These tell us what spend per outcome should be considered good value for money. So say we run the numbers and we find that to fund a new intervention, it costs an additional $1,000 and produces an additional 2 units of health, let's say deaths averted or QALYs gained. I know some of you may not have heard of the QALY before. It stands for Quality Adjusted Life Year, and it's basically just a metric of health. So throughout this presentation, I might be talking about QALYs, and if you're not too sure what they are, basically just think of them as a measurement of health that combines both quality of life and length of life. So anyway, we've run our analysis and we found that it costs an additional $1,000 and it produces an additional 2 units of health. And therefore we can calculate that we're spending $500 per unit of health gained. How do we know whether that's good value for money or not? We need a threshold to compare it to. But what do these thresholds actually represent? So the first idea is this concept of maximizing health. So the role of any economist is to efficiently allocate a finite amount of resources to maximize a chosen outcome. So it doesn't matter whether you're a health economist working for the health service, or if you're working for the transport ministry or any public sector. The idea is that you're given a fixed budget and you're told as an economist, how can we best utilize that budget to produce the best outcomes? So some economists say, okay, well, given that the health service has a fixed budget, we should try and maximize health. And they argue that the QALY is the best metric of health we have. So therefore, if we maximize the number of QALYs the health service can produce, this seems like a sensible strategy. Now this, in the UK, is the implicit objective of health economists at NICE. I say implicit because it's not formally written anywhere that they're there to maximize health, but the concept behind the threshold that NICE uses is so that the NHS, the National Health Service, can maximize the number of QALYs it can produce. So what it means is that the threshold represents the opportunity cost of displaced funds. So the idea is if you have a fixed budget and you want to spend more money on a new intervention, but that money has to come from somewhere. You're going to have to spend less money on, say, cancer treatments or mental health. And the idea is that that money that could have gone towards cancer and mental health, that's going to have a consequence. You're going to lose QALYs by displacing those funds. So basically, you want to make sure that the new intervention is going to produce more QALYs than the intervention that you just displaced to fund this new one. So for every £20,000 you spend on a new intervention, the displaced funds means the NHS loses one QALY. So NICE uses a £20,000 per QALY threshold, and that's what it means. For every £20,000 that you want to spend on a new intervention, one less QALY is produced by the NHS, which means this new intervention better produce more than one QALY per £20,000. Otherwise, you're going to be leaving the health service in a worse state than when you found it. So an intervention is cost effective if it produces more health than the interventions that are displaced to fund it. That's one definition of cost effectiveness. Another idea is that threshold should represent the societal willingness to pay. So how much are we as a society willing to pay to increase the amount of health service can provide? So this only really works if the budget's not finite. So if you think of America, for example, where the budget isn't fixed and that a lot of the spending comes from the private sector, then of course, if the consumer wants to pay for the intervention, then what they deem is good value for money is important. It's also important that the societal preferences align with the budget, if there is one. So, for example, you may have heard the term, life is precious and we should pay whatever it takes to keep people alive. Well, this is a fair point, but it's fairly unrealistic. If we were literally willing to pay whatever it takes to keep people alive, then we wouldn't have any money to spend on the education budget or the defence budget. So, of course, we have a fixed budget and we need to live within our means. So it's important that if we're valuing health as a society, we have to know what the trade-offs are by spending more money on health. The final point is, does society value all health benefits the same? So far I've been assuming that a QALY is a QALY is a QALY. It's a phrase you may have heard before, but it basically means that we value health gains in the elderly exactly the same as we value health gains in the young. We value health gains in those with orphan diseases exactly the same as those in very common diseases. As a society, are we perhaps willing to pay more for interventions in orphan diseases? Which brings us, so to summarise this slide, an intervention is cost effective if it produces health at a lower or equal price to what society is willing to pay. So moving on to the final point, which is this efficiency equity trade-off. So is maximising health really all we want out of a health service? So to think about this, it's just a very simple thought experiment. So let's say we have an individual, her name is Audrey. She has been and always has been a perfectly healthy person. Intervention A is a new drug that removes the health risk that will extend her above average life expectancy by 5 years. Now we have Mildred, who is not very healthy. She's suffered from a chronic disease her whole life. Intervention B costs the same as A, but it alleviates some of Mildred's symptoms. The health benefit, let's just say for simplicity, we're going to measure this in QALYs, is slightly less than A. So you have two interventions. One produces more health, but in a person who's already very healthy. One produces less health, but in a person who is a lot sicker. So should we fund A or B? Well, of course, there is no right answer. In this room, people may have their own opinions about whether we should fund A or B, but what should be clear is that the answer isn't obvious. And the idea of this thought experiment is to highlight that maximising health is perhaps not without controversy. As a society, perhaps improving health equity, so making sure that everyone has that the distribution of health is equal among society, is a goal we may wish to achieve above health maximisation. Maybe we would be happy to provide less health as a society if it meant that it was more evenly distributed. So getting the Mildred's to Audrey's levels of health may be the primary goal we wish to achieve. So in this case, an intervention is cost effective if it produces more health or improves health equity, perhaps with a trade-off for producing less health. So what are the conclusions from this? So that was a very brief taste of what potentially constitutes cost effectiveness. And this whole topic is a seminar in itself. The reason I just wanted to quickly go over it was to allow you to start critically thinking about cost effectiveness. So moving into the realms of zero price cost effectiveness, which we're about to discuss, it's good to have some of these concepts in the back of your mind. So when we are deciding whether something is cost effective, it's important to know that perhaps maximizing health isn't the only objective we wish to achieve. Whichever judgment we come to about what constitutes cost effectiveness, we want to be transparent and we want to be consistent. We don't want some diseases to have a free ride, so be it. So really, when we're defining cost effectiveness, what we're asking is, what is the role of health economics when it comes to informing policy? So when we crunch our numbers and we do our analysis and we feed this back to the policymaker, what are we really telling them? What are we really recommending? Are we saying that we want to maximize health, and if you want to, this is how you want to achieve it? Or are we looking at something more? Okay, so the meat of this presentation, which is in the next slide, is what is zero price cost effectiveness and what are the implications? So what is the definition? So I'm going to first walk through a mathematical definition and then kind of just a broader definition to drum home the point. So the idea is, if you evaluated an intervention that produced 0.5 quality at a cost of $100,000, the ISA, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, would tell you that you are paying $200,000 per quality that's generated. Now, under any threshold, you will find that that is not a cost-effective use of resources, regardless of how you define cost effectiveness. So if an individual costs the health service $100,000 per year and their quality of life is 0.5, then any intervention that extends their life, ceteris paribus, other things remaining equal, will cost at least $200,000 per quality. So if there was ever a life-extending intervention in this group, it would never produce a cost-effective result, because immediately you're starting off by saying this individual costs $200,000 per quality to keep alive. So when you take into account the cost of the intervention on top of that, you're going to be coming up with some very high ISAs, and it's unlikely that you're going to find these interventions to be cost-effective by most threshold standards that are out there. So herein lies the problem of zero price cost effectiveness. So the non-math scoop is basically there are some interventions that have incredibly low quality of life and high costs, and these two tend to go hand in hand. We know that increasing life in these conditions will generate significant costs to the health service, and we know the health outcomes will be relatively low. This means regardless of how much a new life-extending treatment costs, the additional cost associated with just keeping the patient alive is going to prevent this intervention from being cost-effective. And it's important at this point we recognise that it's not just about costs. Health economists get a bad rap, unfairly so, by a lot of people saying, oh, you're just looking at the costs, there's much more to health and life than just looking at costs. And we completely agree. That's why we do cost effectiveness studies. The effectiveness part is just as important part of the equation as the cost part. So what we're saying in these patients is not only are they very expensive, but the potential health outcomes that they have to achieve are very low. So if you extend their life, the quality of life during that period of life extension is going to be very low. So it's not just about the high costs, it's about the low health outcomes that are being achieved as well. But what this all means is that should we continue to allocate funds to new treatments used to treat conditions, knowing that the opportunity cost of these funds could produce much higher health outcomes for other patients? So I'm going to walk through a couple of case studies now, and hopefully this will help drive home the point of zero price cost effectiveness. So the first one I'm going to talk about is Sevilimir. So Sevilimir is a phosphate binding drug that can be given to patients on dialysis instead of calcium carbonate. So these are patients with end-stage renal disease. A recent meta-analysis by Patel et al. Showed that the mortality risk ratio associated with severe relative to calcium carbonate is around 0.5, so effectively doubling the life expectancy of these patients. So to drive home this point, this is one of the studies that was included in the meta-analysis by Gloria et al. And as you can see, the survival curve for severe, which is the dotted line on top, is fairly stable, whereas those on calcium carbonate drops quite significantly. So you can see that this treatment has pretty impressive life-extending properties. Under most normal circumstances, you would say, you know, that's a slam dunk. You don't tend to see effectiveness estimates that high. So the problem with severe is that an individual with end-stage renal disease on dialysis costs the health service around $120,000 per year. People with end-stage renal disease have a quality of life of around 0.6. Therefore, extending their life by 1 year at zero incremental cost produces an incremental cost effectiveness ratio of $200,000 per QALY. So severe would have to have drastic cost-saving properties or quality of life benefits to be considered cost effective. So without even doing the analysis, we already know that under most conventional threshold estimates, severe or any life-extending end-stage renal disease intervention in that matter will not be cost effectiveness, regardless of how much that intervention costs. The next intervention I'm going to talk about is pertuzumab. Apologies if I'm going to butcher some of these clinical names, but just bear with me. So pertuzumab is indicated for a type of breast cancer, and it has a very impressive impact on survival. So it's about 18.5 months relative to 12.4 months. It has a ratio of around about 0.62. Now, the problem is that these patients are going to be on two other treatments, trastuzumab and docetaxel. Now, these are both very high in price, and pertuzumab only works when it's in combination with those two drugs. The problem is that those two drugs cost so much anyway that adding anything on top of them is not going to be cost effective, regardless of how much this new drug costs. So some would say the cost of the incumbent drugs should be excluded. But the important thing to remember is the benefit of pertuzumab only occurs if administered concurrently with current treatments. So basically the situation here is we have current practice making these patients not cost effective. So that even new treatments which come in, which are incredibly effective, can never be cost effective because the current practice isn't a cost effective way of moving forward. So what are the implications of this? Well, there are some conditions where life-extending interventions will never be cost-effective. Of course, I keep using the term cost-effective in inverted commas because, of course, it depends on how you define cost-effectiveness. But here, I'm talking more about the conventional way of looking at cost-effectiveness, which is looking at these predefined thresholds. So, as I mentioned before, it's important we look at quality of life, not just costs. So what I've done here is I've ranked 5 different conditions: perfect health, asthma, type 2 diabetes, motor neuron disease, and end-stage renal disease. I've noted what their annual cost is and what the quality of life is for that condition. Now, when you know those two pieces of information, you can calculate what the willingness to pay is for an extra year of life is. So to calculate this willingness to pay, you have to have a threshold. So here I'm assuming a $50,000 per QALY threshold, which is a commonly used threshold in Canada. So to calculate the willingness to pay, you say, okay, what are the health benefits and how much are we willing to pay for them? So if we look at perfect health, we'd say their quality of life is 1. So therefore, if we extend their life by 1 year, we're willing to pay $50,000 per QALY for that. And then we subtract any costs that it costs to treat that condition. So I've assumed in this scenario, perfect health costs the health service nothing. So here we're willing to pay $50,000 for 1 year of perfect health. Now let's look at an individual with asthma. Now their quality of life is lower at 0.87, and they cost the health service at $330 per year to treat. So when you calculate this, you will find out that the willingness to pay is less than that of perfect health. So we're willing to pay $43,000 for an additional year of life in an asthma patient. Moving down the list to type 2 diabetes, we're willing to pay $41,000 per quality. $41,000 per additional year of life. And then we get to motor neuron disease, and things start to get a little bit tricky. So motor neuron disease, for those of you who do not know, you may have heard of it as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease. It was associated with the Ice Bucket Challenge, but it's a very debilitating disease, so it has very high costs and very low quality of life. So here we're looking at the willingness to pay for an extra year of life in an individual with motor neuron disease is only $3,000. Now, this is a condition that has a life expectancy of around about 2 years. So, if you were to increase their life by an additional year, which would be substantial, you're only willing to pay $3,000 for it, as opposed to $50,000 for an individual who was perfectly healthy. And then, of course, you hit the bottom of the list, which is end-stage renal disease, where the cost is so high and the quality of life is so low that you're not willing to pay anything for an additional year of life. And in fact, if you calculate it properly, it's not just zero, it's actually minus $90,000. And I won't go into the implications of what that means. But basically, what this table demonstrates is how we are pricing some conditions out of the market. So yeah, in conclusion, zero price cost effectiveness means that we are going to be pricing some life-extending treatments out of the market for some conditions. If we assume the role of the health economist is to maximize health, then extending life in these conditions is certainly not cost effective. And enforcing such rules could increase health inequities. So if you go back to my previous slide, we're going to be making the healthy healthier because we're willing to pay more for that. And we're going to be making the sick sicker because we're not going to be providing new treatments that come onto the market. So is that really fair? Okay, so what costs can be included in economic analysis, and how are health technology assessment bodies moving forward? So I've sort of alluded to this point back in one of the case studies I represented, where I said it was the cost of the current practice of the incumbent drugs that were preventing the intervention from being cost effective. And some people say, well, just don't include those costs then. So what I'll be doing is going through which costs are currently included and excluded, and moving forward, what guidelines are telling us to include when it comes to costs. So like I said, the issue of zero price cost effectiveness is brought about by including costs in additional years of life. So is that necessarily the right thing to do? So currently, when we're measuring costs in an economic analysis, there are said to be related costs and unrelated costs. We include the related costs and we exclude the unrelated costs. So until now, a general rule of thumb has been to include costs related to the condition and or intervention. So let's take an example. Let's say we're evaluating a life-extending asthma drug. Then we should include all asthma-related costs and costs that arise because of the intervention. So say the intervention produces side effects, which are going to cost money to treat, then we need to include those costs. Let's say it prevents comorbidities later down the line, then we need to include those cost savings. So we will include the asthma costs in additional years of life, but what we won't include are costs associated with, say, cancer. Now, because you're extending that patient's length of life, they're more likely to develop cancer. However, it's not related to asthma and it's not related to the intervention, so we say it's an unrelated cost and we would exclude it under current practices. Now, the implications of including certain costs. Well, the costs we decide to include, of course, have a direct impact on whether the issue of zero price cost effectiveness even exists. So if we decide that survival costs are unrelated, or that only costs attributable to the intervention are related, then this problem of zero price cost effectiveness disappears. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in the literature about what costs we should include and exclude. And the following paper provides a great summary of this literature. It's by Davis et al., and it's done by the NICE Decision Support Unit. So NICE was finding that this issue of zero price cost effectiveness was cropping up in a lot of their technology assessments. So they tasked the Decision Support Unit to look into this issue and come up with potential solutions. So now I'm going to summarize very briefly what this paper said about which costs to include and which costs to exclude. So yeah, we have the cost of the intervention and the cost of the condition. And what some people argue is, well, actually, we're evaluating the cost effectiveness of this intervention. So let's just forget these condition costs. Let's just focus on the cost of the intervention. Well, the response to that is, well, regardless of whether we include the costs related to the condition, the health service is still going to incur them. And those costs do have an opportunity cost. They could be spent on something else. So it's really fair to exclude them. The other point that they argue is practices which constitute the current standard of care and whose delivery of effectiveness is not affected by the addition of the intervention should be considered unrelated. So basically, anything that we've already agreed, for example, dialysis, the patient gets dialysis, then we should be including those costs because we've already made a decision that that's going to be included regardless of whether you introduce this new intervention. Now, what they argue is it's difficult to argue that the benefits of the new intervention are not related to current practice. So, for example, if you stop doing dialysis, the patient will die and the benefit of the treatment is zero. So the benefit of the treatment is completely contingent on current practice. So therefore, if we're including the benefit of current practice, then to keep our equation balanced, we should include the costs as well. Now, just a thought experiment. Say we have intervention A, say it's a surgery. It has enormous life-extending properties in a condition that's not expensive to treat. The surgery, however, is complex and long, and it results in significant upfront costs. Now, intervention B, say it's a drug, has modest life-extending properties in a condition that's very expensive to treat, and the drug is very cheap. So here, intervention A, which is the surgery, I really hope these numbers are right, I did this in the car. $9,000 is the cost of the surgery, and this patient lives an additional 5 years. The cost of that additional 5 years of life is $1,000. Intervention B, the drug is very cheap, only costs $1,000. It only extends life by 1 additional year. It's very expensive to keep these patients alive. It costs $9,000 for that additional year of life. So in the red, those are the costs associated with the additional years of life, and blue represents the cost of the intervention. So let's say, do you know what? Costs that occur in additional years of survival, we're not interested in those. Oh, sorry. So for intervention A, we're paying $2,000 per additional year of life. And for intervention B, we're paying $10,000 per additional year of life. So at this point, we would say A represents better value for money than B. But let's say, you know what? Let's ignore costs related to additional years of life. Now, these are the costs that we're left with. Now, intervention A costs $9,000, but now intervention B only costs $1,000. We recalculate our ISAs. We're now paying $1,800 per additional year of life for intervention A, and we're paying $1,000 per additional year of life of intervention B. So now intervention B is a lot more cost effective than intervention A. Now, what this goes to show is that we exclude costs associated with additional years of life, B would always get funded, even though it's less clinically effective. So in reality, both cost the health service the same. Both cost $10,000. We're not saving money by choosing B over A, regardless of whether we choose to include the costs in our analysis or not. But what we are doing is we're funding less clinically effective medicine. So this idea of excluding costs may sound sensible because it seems fair, but it isn't without consequences. So what are guidelines saying? So at the moment, I've been talking about cost rates for condition and cost related to the intervention. Now guidelines are actually going beyond that and are saying, you know what, include everything. Remember I said don't include the cost of the cancer treatment that comes up because the patient lives longer. Well, now actually do include that. So CADIF, for example, they say exclude costs where in fairness, the CADIF definition is a little bit ambiguous, but Murray was on the panel that came up with this recommendation, so he's pretty clear this is what it means. But what they say is the resource use or event would have occurred regardless of whether the intervention is used. So obviously costs in additional years of life wouldn't have occurred had this new treatment been given. So any costs that occur in those additional years of life should be included. Likewise, the Dutch National Health Care Institute says that indirect costs should be included in additional years of life. So they're much more clear and transparent, include additional costs that are associated in additional years of life. So moving forward, this is going to exacerbate the problem of zero price cost effectiveness because now the cost of additional years of life aren't just including the cost of the condition, but also anything else that could happen to that individual. So this problem of zero price cost effectiveness is a problem now, but in the future it's going to be much more widespread.
I mean, the problem arises once you start comparing with the threshold.
Yeah.
So if the threshold is the ability of the healthcare system to produce health, let's say,
Yeah.
and within a specific disease sector,
Yeah.
the ability of the healthcare system to produce health is low, therefore the system is inefficient in producing health, and the cost of an extra life is high.
Yeah.
Maybe the comparison against a common threshold is a naive comparison, maybe.
Totally, and you're jumping ahead. So we're going to talk about that for the potential solutions for zero price cost effectiveness. But I suppose what I'm talking about now is if we keep the current way of doing things, we use our thresholds, then this problem will be exacerbated unless we tackle it using said theories. Also, NICE are also looking into this, and it looks likely that they will eventually be implementing this. The reason they haven't already is because there's a lot of political pushback from pharma companies to say, no, your guidelines are fine as they are, don't change them. So conclusion. So again, the costs that we choose to include are vital when it comes to the issue of zero price cost effectiveness. And the main argument for including these costs is to be fair. So when we're doing our analysis and we're looking at the life expectancy of a patient, we will use national life tables. We don't think twice about including the benefit of these future interventions that may occur. So if we're going to include the benefit, then really to be fair, we should also include the cost as well. So that's the general consensus about why we should be inclusive about our costs to make sure that our analysis are balanced. And likewise, this is the prevailing thought that health technology assessment bodies are moving forward with, and it's likely NICE will follow suit at some point in the future. So what are the potential solutions to zero price cost effectiveness? So there's kind of two ways to deal with this issue. The first way is methodological. So we can be selective about what costs to analyze, which I've previously discussed, or maybe we could weight utilities or change the threshold. Maybe we should weight quality of life in some conditions higher than we do others. And I'll go into more detail about that in a minute. Or, likewise, we could change the threshold. Maybe there are some conditions where we're willing to pay a little bit extra for what we would consider cost effective relative to other conditions. Secondly, another option is we keep the methodology as is, but agree on ways in which the conclusions can be interpreted. And one thing we haven't really discussed is, zero price cost effectiveness is controversial, but is it a problem? Maybe some patients are too expensive to keep alive. Not something that I am personally saying, but what I'm saying is it's a discussion that we should have as a society. Let's not just assume that, no, this isn't fair, that's not right. Like, let's open it up, let's have patient panels to talk about it. So, whereas before, I suppose I was kind of talking about, not objective facts, but I was kind of relaying what the literature says. The following is going to be my opinion, so feel free to just rip it apart if you don't agree with what I'm saying for the rest of this presentation. But do you have a question?
I do. I just wondered with these solutions then, are there times whenever people are moving away from quality adjusted life years, where it's quality of life and application to society as a population, to utility of the individual? So, I always look at the two extremes: a child who's born and then is an ICU person, and heavy costs, and will continue to have a disabled and non-contributory or less contributory societal role compared with an individual who is at the other end of the spectrum, who's had a contribution role or does not have a future contribution role. That those also get incorporated into these societal perspective analyses. Because what an individual can bring to society in terms of cost is negating also. Very dangerous.
No, of course, totally. So I suppose general state of the literature at the moment is that qualities they're pretty transparent and they're pretty well established as a methodology. Now, like you said, expanding beyond the quality and including more stuff is something that researchers have definitely looked into. They've looked into sort of capabilities of the patient, for example. The problem is first of all, when we start including these additional aspects of benefit. First of all, it makes the analysis a little bit more complicated. You know, how we measure quality of life and life expectancy is already, you know, I hate to think of health economics as a black box exercise, but it kind of is becoming that, where clinicians are just saying, you know, we want you to do this, and then you do your analysis, and then you come back with this, which really, we want people to be involved at all stages of the process. So making the process more complicated is kind of moving health economics further away from reality. So that's one concern that health economists have. Another is you end up opening up a can of worms for some of these cases. You feel like you solve one controversial issue and then you introduce another. One example I always think of is when people say, oh, wait, why don't you include the costs associated with earnings loss? This person is contributing to the economy, and if this condition is preventing them from working, then why aren't you including the lost earnings to the economy of excluding, you know, why do we exclude those costs? Well, the reason why we do is two reasons. First of all, how do you value those lost earnings? Say there's a condition that affects bankers, are we going to then value their contribution to society more than an intervention which only affects those from a lower socioeconomic background? So how do you value contribution to society? Do you value it in wages earned? Because that's going to lead to some very controversial decisions. And then another problem is you're then very much disadvantaging sort of the retired and those who aren't of working age, and likewise those who can't work. So you feel like you've solved one controversial issue, and then you just bring in another one. So it's about, you know, keeping our analysis simple and transparent. But by all means, if we feel that, you know, there is a benefit to this intervention, you know, the capability benefit, for example, that is just not being captured, then there is an option to look at that and say, okay, the sensitivity analysis, if we were to include the extra benefits and give that back to the policymaker, is this going to influence your decision anymore? Okay, so the methodological solution. So the first methodological solution is, as previously discussed, be restrictive about what costs we include. For example, exclude survival costs or costs not related to the intervention. Personally, I'm not a fan. I don't like this. It's very difficult to be consistent with this rule across the board. You know, for some conditions, you're like, oh, we're going to exclude this cost, but we're going to include that one. And then for other conditions, you're then going to come up with a different rule. So it's difficult to be consistent and it's difficult to be transparent. And the problem is that these costs occur regardless of whether we include them in our analysis or not. So my personal opinion is that as a health economist, I want to inform the policymaker. And I want to say, you know, if you fund this intervention, this is how much it is going to cost, and this is the benefit that will be contributed to this intervention. You know, especially for sort of budgetary reasons, to be like excluding these costs and then they do a budget impact analysis, like, whoa, you know, this is only going to cost an additional $10 per query, but actually it's going to eat up our whole budget to fund this. I feel like it's going to create problems. Another methodological solution is to apply utility weights to conditions that are affected by this problem. So these weights would represent society's willingness to trade off maximizing health against equity considerations. So for example, end-stage renal disease, where I was saying, you know, their quality of life is 0.4, maybe we should weight that higher. Maybe we get like a double weight, so it would be 0.8. And these weights wouldn't be arbitrary. They would be informed by preference decisions. There's a methodology behind how to calculate these equity weights. If you are interested in that, there is the paper by Cookson, which goes into more detail about how that's done. Now, I'm kind of in two minds about this. First of all, I think involving the public is important in tackling this decision. I don't think it's fair for us to just assume how to move forward without, you know, as health economists, we need to branch out on this issue. We can't just sit here and solve it methodologically. I think we need to bring in, you know, not just patients, but those who make the decisions about how medicine is funded. The only issue I have with this is, as I kind of alluded to earlier, it adds like another level of complexity to what sometimes is already quite a complex situation to begin with, and it starts to remove health economics further away from reality, where we're saying, oh, you know, these are the health benefits to these patients, but we weight them doubly because this is what this is, and you can see how the decision making can be sitting there and saying, so you've done that, but why again? And I don't know, it makes health economics a little bit less transparent. I suppose my preference is to keep what we do very simple, very clear, so that I feel like that's the best way to inform policy. So the Haines solution, patent pending. I say we keep our analysis the same, but we be transparent and thorough in our conclusions. We tell the policymaker what the additional spend is, but where that additional spend is coming from. So, with regards to the dialysis example, we say this is how much it's going to cost to do this intervention. However, you need to recognise that 90% of that cost is coming just from keeping this patient alive. The cost associated with the treatment is very small. And then, for example, we can have a breakdown of the proportion of the cost difference that's generated through the additional costs from extra years of life and the additional costs associated with the intervention. And we can even rerun our analysis. We do, okay, do you know what? We're going to do a sensitivity analysis where we're going to exclude these additional years of life, and this is what impact it has on our item. So we don't weight anything, we don't fudge anything. We just keep things very simple, and we're very transparent and honest with the policymaker and say, this is the situation. Now, we don't have to jump forward and say, therefore, this is not cost effective and you shouldn't do it. Because I think as health economists, that's kind of overstepping the mark. Like, our role is to feed into a policy decision. Our role is to give more information so that the right decision can be made. This is my preferred solution. It's not very sexy. I'm a firm believer in keeping things simple. And also, it doesn't assume that zero price cost effectiveness is an issue that needs to be solved. Some say it is, some say it isn't. Again, I think it's about bringing this to the attention of the public and the decision makers and having an informed discussion. So make things as simple as possible, but not simple. Simpler. Einstein said that. So he's pretty smart. And he was all about keeping things simple. So I'm going to go for that solution personally. So conclusions, zero price cost effectiveness is an issue that needs to be recognised and addressed. We can't just kind of keep muddling on and saying, oh, there's an issue of zero price cost effectiveness, because like I say, moving forward, this issue is going to be exacerbated with the inclusion of additional costs in years of life. It's not a flaw in health economic methodology. You get some people that turn to you and be like, oh, health economics is a bunch of nonsense, isn't it? Like, you've come up with this obviously wrong conclusion. It's like, well, no, we're not telling you this is, the conclusion. We're saying this is the state of the world. We're saying if you want to fund these medications, this is the additional cost and this is the additional benefit. Now, under most thresholds, we've said it's not cost effective. However, we're not telling you it's not cost effective. We're just saying this is what the state of the world is. So moving forward, the literature provides us with methodological fixes. So if we do want to solve this as health economists, we say, you know what, we'll solve this in our own little world and we'll bring it back to you, then that's fine. We can do that. We have methodological fixes. We can change the threshold. We can weight qualities differently. We can choose which costs to exclude. But if we want to be open and transparent with decision makers, then perhaps some medical processes are outdated and they do need to be re-evaluated. So perhaps maybe, just maybe, some people are too expensive to keep alive, but let's not just assume. Let's talk about it. And there's some references if anyone would like to explore this issue further or find out why it's a bit more effective. Yeah, that's it.
Yes, we have time for a few questions.
Oh.
Yeah. I think.
Is it not a little bit of a cop-out to say as health economists that it's to leave it to the policymakers? And are you not assuming that policymakers are more engaged in actually thinking in the way you think? And that they're not being a little more superficial? Is that not?
I'm not saying we shouldn't be involved in this discussion. I'm saying we shouldn't be the only ones involved in this discussion. So there are methodological fixes to this problem, and that's fine. That's great. We can solve this as a health economics unit and bring this back to the policymaker. But I think that given the context of this issue, if you say to someone, oh, some patients are too expensive to keep alive, immediately that phrase in itself makes a lot of people jump up. So I think that those opinions need to be taken into account when we make our methodological fixes. Maybe we go to the policymaker and they go, do you know what, your methodological fix is fantastic. Go ahead with that, and that's fine. That's what we should do. But I suppose my preference is that we should be keeping policymakers in the dark about this issue. We shouldn't be solving it without at least bringing it to their attention first. And sure, maybe the methodological fix is the right way forward. And if that's the case, fine. But I don't think that we as health economists can solve this issue by ourselves. I think we need additional input from other, and not just policymakers, but patients as well. And we know we all utilize the health service. So really, we should have a say in how things are funded. Maybe as a society, we do just want to maximize health. We don't care about health equity. But again, it's just an issue that needs to be brought to wider attention.
So, do you think that the way that the current system functions and the way that we have chosen to allocate funds over hundreds of years in the past has some information that would be useful for informing us how we should allocate resources in the future?
Yeah, totally. I suppose my only reservation about how resources are allocated is, we're still kind of in the infancy, not just of health economics, but of kind of evidence-based medicine. And since evidence-based medicine has helped us inform how interventions resources should be allocated, you can kind of imagine there's a period of time where the efficient allocation of resources started to happen, whereas before it was more done on kind of finger in the wind kind of scenario. So I suppose we just need to be careful whereby we're looking at efficient allocation of resources, as opposed to maybe there was some inefficient allocation of resource decisions made in the past due to limited information. And not just from health economics, but just from evidence-based healthcare in general.
I see. I mean, okay, so maybe there would be a way, so you have a great point there, but maybe there would be a way that you could tease out what the information about the way that the health system functions now and the decision we made to allocate resources could reveal about your preferences of spending more, your willingness of spending more on a specific population versus another. I mean, the fact for dialysis, the fact that we keep spending for dialysis patients must say something about.
No, I completely agree. I think and this is another problem, is that we don't really know how these decisions are made. Nice to have this £20,000 per quality threshold, which sounds very official, but you look into the ins and outs of how it was calculated, and it's basically just a bunch of people saying we think this number looks good. So I am all for research into how health outcomes are basically kind of trying to calculate what a threshold is or how resources are currently allocated. That information at the moment doesn't exist. They tried to do it in the UK, but it's still at its infancy. But I think that if I was to choose one issue in health economics that all the research funding should be going towards, I think that is the one. Because if we have an idea about how we're currently allocating resources and what are the consequences of spending additional money, then that's going to have a huge impact on how we choose to move forward. So yeah, I agree.
Do we have any questions?
No.
What do you think of factor age?
So we kind of implicitly already do that in health economic evaluations anyway. So when we're evaluating a condition, a treatment which is utilised in a child, the potential to gain is already astronomically more than if we're evaluating a treatment that's in a sort of an 80-year-old patient. So in a way, we are already incorporating age, given the potential of benefit for a treatment. But yes, I suppose what you'd be alluding to is, should we be weighting different ages separately? I suppose, I can't remember who gave the presentation data rounds earlier, but you see the bathtub scenario whereby, you have huge high-cost users at one end of the spectrum, and that the amount spent on children is a lot lower, and maybe making that distribution more equal is something that we should be moving towards. I don't know how I feel about that, and I don't think it's my opinion to decide how resources should be allocated. Again, I think it's something you take back to the wider public. Are we happy with the amount that we spend on the older generation in palliative care? And if we're not, then how are we going to redistribute those funds in an equitable and transparent way.
I think it's a really good discussion point. I am a geriatric nephrologist, so I look after old dialysis patients. And theoretically, it's cheaper to fund the patients that I look after than it is to do pediatric dialysis, because these patients are going to need dialysis for the rest of their lives, and they will never contribute to society, which is where I came from that issue, whereas my older people have contributed already. And so it's a very controversial thing, and I think whenever you're looking not only at the benefits for dialyzing a child, you have to look at the cost of dialyzing a child, which will mean some inevitable hideous levels of cost. So we shouldn't even think of it. And there's that whole societal consequence.
So I suppose.
And I think that's a quagmire.
No, definitely. And I suppose you've kind of got two separate issues here. You've got one about, how we come up with our analysis, and then B, how do we interpret the conclusions?
And C, what does society react to whatever you say?
And the interpretation of the conclusion is exactly what you're talking about now. How do society react to the methodology that we've chosen to come up with our outcomes? But
That's it. Thank you so much for coming. Sorry for starting late.
So it triggered my attention.